Hello, Rob Venn here. Welcome to this PowerPoint on the introduction to AS media theory. So what I'm going to look at today, we're going to have a very brief introduction to some of the core media studies theories that we're going to be looking at in this topic, but I will link some other videos as well you can go and have a look at, which will go into it in more depth. You are obviously going to need to be able to apply these theories in essays to the way in which TV dramas create representations. All of this is for question 1, which is in section A on your exam paper. That's the textual analysis and representation element. You'll get an unseen moving image extract, which you'll have to analyse in the exam. It's all part of Unit G322, Key Media Concepts, TV Drama. That's the name of your exam. Now, the first theory is a very important one. This is called mediation. Stuart Hall coined this term back in 1980. And it's the very purpose of media studies. It's why media studies exists. It's what we're doing when we're studying the media. We're studying mediation. Now, what this means is that media creators, whoever they may be, could be the writer of a TV show, the director of a film, the writer of a magazine article, whatever, they carefully choose everything that appears in that media text. Every camera angle, every word of dialogue, every word in a sentence has been carefully picked and chosen in order to communicate a particular meaning, to create what Stuart Hall called a preferred reading, a certain understanding that they want you to get from that media product. That process of carefully choosing what to put in a media product is called encoding. So meaning has been encoded into that text. I'm going to link you to a PBS Ideas channel video which looks at this in a lot more detail. I highly recommend you watch it. It's very good. Now, one of the key things we're going to need to look about with representation is how people are depicted. Now, this is something you will already have done before. We did it back at the beginning of the year. We looked at this idea of objectification. Objectification is where people are treated as an object. They are dehumanized. They're treated as a thing. This is particularly applied to women. Women are treated often as sex objects. They are objectified to provide erotic male pleasure. So Laura Mulvey coined this term back in 1975. It's one of the most famous and important of all media theories. Voyeurism is, of course, the pleasure derived from watching others whilst undetected. So spying on people, basically, for pleasure. When you think about it, this is essentially the basis of all media. We are an unseen observer looking at other people's lives. Doesn't matter if it's the news or a sitcom or reading a novel. In most cases, the people we're watching in that story are unaware of being watched. Ultimate examples of voyeurism, of course, is reality television, especially things like Big Brother. I know they know they're being watched, but they are being watched all the time. Another key one you should already know about, Carl Rogers' Sense of Ideal Self from 1961. Carl Rogers was a psychologist, and he talked about the fact that everybody has in their head an ideal self image of what they would be like in a perfect world. Now, where does that ideal self come from? Well, the media are going to be very important in shaping our sense of an ideal self. The media tell us what is attractive. They provide aspirational role models for us. They give us images of what is considered attractive, intelligent, suave, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, erudite. They create these images that we as audience members live up to. We want to be like them. We idolize them. Now, if we can have an ideal self, then it stands to reason that we can also have an ideal partner. a sense in our head of what our ideal sexual or romantic partner would be. And yet again, the media is going to have an exceptionally important role to play in shaping that concept. A lot of this is to do with stereotyping. When we talk about representations, stereotypes are very, very important. Now, stereotypes are generally thought of as being a bad thing, but they're not necessarily a bad thing. They're a standardized and simplified conception of a group or an individual based on prior assumptions. So in other words, we tend to categorize people based on what they've got in common with one another. In a way, we like to stereotype ourselves. You know, we think of ourselves in a certain way. Now, sometimes these stereotypes are based on reality, sometimes they are completely fabricated. But they got to have some kind of basis in reality in order to exist. Think of the dumb blonde stereotype, for example. Hair colour can have no relationship whatsoever to levels of intelligence. So where did it come from? Well, it comes from Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was the archetypal dumb blonde. Before then, blonde actresses like Mae West were known for being witty and intelligent and clever. But Marilyn Monroe shaped that dumb blonde stereotype that exists to this day. Stereotypes are only a negative thing when they're used to discriminate against others, to treat them differently. They're not necessarily a bad thing. You can have positive stereotypes. We might consider, say, doctors are, as caring and intelligent and rich. Well, yeah, of course they are. They're well paid. They have to be intelligent to be doctors. It's a stereotype, but it's got a basis in truth. Of course, having said that, not all doctors are positive. Harold Shipman was a doctor, didn't stop him being one of Britain's most successful serial killers. Which brings us to the idea of binary opposites. For those of you who don't know this, binary means composed of two pieces or two parts, or something that can be in one state or another state. A switch, for example, can be on or off. It's binary. The term binary opposites can be traced to Claude Levi-Strauss from 1969. He talked about narratives, stories, and how they often have binaries in them. Good versus evil, right versus wrong, hero versus villain. These are examples of binary opposites. Now, when it comes to the representations in this part of the course, there are 7 representations that we're going to be focusing on. Gender, social class and status, ability and disability, age, ethnicity, regional identity, and sexuality. Now, all of these can be reduced to basic binary opposites. Gender is obviously male versus female. Class can be, those who have power versus those who don't have power. That could be upper class versus lower class, for example. We've got ability versus disability. Well, obviously those who are able-bodied versus those who are disabled in some way. We've got age, young versus old. We've got ethnicity, which could be anything, but I think would probably be most likely to be manifested as, usually British versus non-British, or it could be white versus non-white. We've got regional identity, and that could be anything. One region versus another. For example, it could be urban versus rural. It could be north versus south. It could be, one county versus another county, like, Yorkshire versus Lancashire. Or, of course, one of the countries. We've got England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Channel Islands. Could be any of them. And then finally we've got sexuality, which would be, as a binary, heterosexual versus homosexual. Of course, all of these are more complicated. I seem to remember that Facebook has something like 32 different options when it comes to choosing your gender. Social class. Well, we already know about the National Readership Survey social classes, for example. The A, B, C1, C2, D and E. Just basically upper class versus middle class versus working class versus underclass. the Marxist idea of the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the lumpenproletariat. So class is much more complicated than just a binary. Same with ability and disability. You know, the Paralympics has taught us nothing. It's taught us that, you know, having some kind of physical disability isn't necessarily a disability. You've got age, again, a complex process. Young versus old can have all sorts of connotations. Ethnicity, well, that could be anything. Regional identity, again, could be anything. Sexuality is very much a sliding scale, from homosexual through heterosexual, through bisexual, through asexual. So it's not always necessarily something as simple as a binary opposite. Binary opposites, however, do make life an awful lot easier, and chances are in the exam it will be an obvious binary opposite. Now, one of the things that's going to affect what we're looking at in the exam is the kind of genre we're looking at. Representations in different genres are going to be dependent on what genre it is. Genre, for those of you who don't know, is a French word. It means type or category or class. And basically we tend to lump media text together based on a common characteristics, and that is their genre. Think film genres, for example, western, sci-fi, horror, things like that. We'll look at that in more detail in class. We tend to categorize things into genre based on their shared characteristics. And the terms we use for those shared characteristics are generic characteristics, or generic elements, or generic tropes. They all mean the same thing. They're the ingredients that make up a particular genre. They are generally categorized into these basic categories. There is the visuals, the look, the visual style of the genre. This would include things like the mise en scène. Mise en scène means everything in the scene. Props, costumes, locations, lighting, camera work, blocking, so in other words where people are on screen, all that kind of stuff. We've got the types of story, the type of narrative that are typical to a genre. We've got the themes, the messages, the ideas, the ideologies that are underneath the genre. And we've got the generic types, certain characters that appear regularly. If you looked at soap operas, for example, generic types might include the, you know, impetuous teenager, the matriarchal mother figure, the cheating, caddish husband, for example. The main themes of soap opera include, basically in this country particularly, about domesticity. They're about relationships. They're about, you know, the family. They have intertwining, non-stop narratives that never finish, that, you know, all intertwine with one another. And in terms of mise en scène, they're very domestic. They, particularly British ones, tend to look very convincing and realistic. EastEnders and Coronation Street, for example. So, what I would suggest you do now is you start creating a glossary. You want to put a glossary for media terminology, a glossary for media theory, and a glossary for just general words you've learned. So, some of the media terminology for the start off your glossary would be mediation. We've got the idea of the micro element versus the macro element. Micro means little, macro means big. So, in the terms of this exam, the macro elements are the representations. The micro elements are things like the shot types, the camera angles, the composition of the images, the camera movement, the mise en scène, the editing, and the sound. Now, how do all those create the macro meanings? Then you've got genre, generic characteristics or elements or tropes, whatever you want to call it. We've got the idea of encoding meaning into a media product, which the audience will then decode the meaning of. And we've got our preferred readings. Theories you can add: Stuart Hall, mediation theory, Laura Mulvey, the male gaze, Claude Levi-Strauss, binary opposites, Carl Rogers, ideal self. We've got a couple of narrative ones which you don't really need to know. Svetlana Todorov's narrative structure and Robin Nelson's narrative structure. You don't really need them. But Walter Lippmann's stereotyping theory, that would be a good one to remember. Very important, that one. Just some general words, things like objectification, voyeurism, equilibrium. That was to do with Todorov. It means balance. And that's it. Okay, I know that's brief, but this is all you really need to know. We'll go into it in more detail in class. There are some other videos you need to watch, but we'll go over this in class. Don't forget you need to make loads and loads of notes.